How does it feel to be a problem? Just over a century ago, Webb Du Bois asked that very question in his American classic, The Souls of Black Folk, and he offered an answer. Being a problem is a strange experience, he wrote, peculiar even, no doubt evoking the peculiar institution of slavery. Du Bois composed his text during Jim Crow, a time of official racial segregation that deliberately obscured to the wider world the human details of African American life. Determined to pull back the veil separating populations, he showed his readers a fuller picture of the black experience, including the meaning of its religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls. A century later, Arabs and Muslim Americans are the new problem of American society. But there have, of course, been others. Native Americans, labeled merciless Indian savages by the Declaration of Independence, were said to be beyond civilization and able to comprehend only the brute language of force. With the rise of Catholic immigration to the country in the 19th century, Irish and Italian Americans were attacked for their religion. They suffered mob violence and frequent accusations of holding papal loyalties above Republican values. During World War I, German Americans were loathed and reviled. Sauerkraut was dubbed Liberty Cabbage, and several states banned the teaching of German, convinced that the language itself promoted un-American values. Between the World Wars, anti-Semitism drove Jewish Americans out of universities and jobs and fueled wild and pernicious conspiracy theories concerning warfare and world domination. Japanese Americans were herded like cattle into internment camps during World War II, as were smaller numbers of German, Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian Americans. Chinese Americans were commonly suspected of harboring communist sympathies during the McCarthy era, frequently losing careers and livelihoods. And Hispanic Americans have long been seen as outsider threats to American culture, even though their presence here predates the formation of the present-day United States. But since the terrorist attacks of September 11th and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Arabs and Muslims, two groups virtually unknown to most Americans prior to 2001, now hold the dubious distinction of being the first new communities of suspicion after the hard-won victories of the civil rights era. Even if prejudice continues to persist in our society, the American creed of fairness was now supposed to mean that we ought to be judged not by our religion, gender, color, or country of origin, but simply by the content of our individual characters. The terrorist attacks, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the explosion of political violence around the world have put that dream in jeopardy for American Arabs and Muslims. In the eyes of some Americans, they have become collectively known as the dangerous outsiders. Bias crimes against Arabs, Muslims, and those assumed to be Arab or Muslim spiked 1,700% in the first 6 months after September 11th, and have never since returned to their pre-2001 levels. A USA Today Gallup poll from 2006 shows that 39% of Americans admit to holding prejudice against Muslims and believe that all Muslims, U.S. citizens included, should carry special IDs. Different studies from the University of Illinois at Chicago, Harvard, and Purdue have each concluded that the more positively one feels about the United States, the more likely one is to harbor anti-Arab feelings, Hostility remains high. Government policies certainly haven't helped the situation. Mass arrests following the attacks increased general suspicion against Arabs and Muslims in this country. The government demanded that non-immigrant males from 24 Muslim-majority countries register their whereabouts in this country, leading to deportation proceedings against almost 14,000 people, and racial profiling, almost universally loathed prior to 2001, assumed a new lease on life in 2003 when President George W. Bush ordered a ban on the practice, but included exceptions permitting use of race and ethnicity to combat potential terrorist attacks. While it could now be said that profiling other groups was officially and legally un-American, profiling Arabs and Muslims made good national security sense. But what exactly is a profile? It's a sketch in charcoal, the simplified contours of a face, a silhouette in black and white, a textbook description of a personality. By definition, a profile draws... Had to wave to my neighbor. A profile... Where was I? By definition, a profile draws an incomplete picture. It substitutes recognition for detail. It is what an outsider from the street observes when looking through the window pane of someone else's life. Profiling Arabs and Muslims has in reality expanded far beyond the realms of law enforcement. Arab and Muslim Americans are now routinely profiled in their places of employment, in housing, for public opinion polls, and in the media. Yet they remain curiously unknown. Broadly speaking, the representations that describe them tend to fall into two types: the exceptional assimilated immigrant or the violent fundamentalist, with very little room in between. The questions they are asked in the media and in real life constantly circle, simplistically, around the same frames of reference: terrorism, women, and assimilation, fixations that may be understandable in this age, but frequently overlook the complex human dimensions of Muslim American and Arab American life. Terms such as moderate and radical are bandied about so freely as to mean nothing. Next to nothing. And cliched phrases like sleeper cells, alienated Muslims, radicalization, and homegrown terrorists degrade the language to a point that they structure the thinking about Muslims living among us. It seems barely an exaggeration to say that Arab and Muslim Americans are constantly talked about, but almost never heard from. The problem is not that they lack representations, but that they have too many, and these are all abstractions. Arabs and Muslims have become a foreign policy issue, an argument on the domestic agenda, a law enforcement priority, and a point of well-meaning concern. They appear as shadowy characters on terror television shows, have become objects of sociological inquiry, and get paraded around as puppets for public diplomacy. Pop culture is awash with their images. Hookah cafes entice East Village socialites. Fashionistas appropriate the checkered keffiyeh scarf. The Prince sings an ode to a young Arab. And Prince sings an ode to a young Arab American girl. They are floating everywhere in the virtual landscape of the national imagination as either villains of Islam or victims of Arab culture. Yet, as in the postmodern world in which we live, sometimes when you are everywhere, you are really nowhere. Frankly, It's beleaguering, like living on a treadmill, an exhausting condition. University of Michigan anthropologists Sally Howell and Andrew Shryock succinctly describe the situation when they write that in the aftermath of 9/11, Arab and Muslim Americans have been compelled time and time again to apologize for acts they did not commit, to condemn acts they never condoned, and to openly profess loyalties that, for most U.S. citizens, are merely assumed. Yet, despite the apologies, condemnations, and professions, their voices still aren't heard. And while so many terrible things have happened in the past years, plenty of good things have also occurred. From Japanese American groups speaking out against today's wartime policies, to prominent civil rights activists fighting for due process for Muslim and Arab clients, to ordinary people reaching out to one another in everyday encounters. Much of this happens quietly in church basements, in mosques holding open houses, in Jewish centers, or in university or community halls. But such events, too, are often obscured, drowned out by the ideology of our age. Yet what most remains in the shadows today are the human dimensions of how Arabs and Muslims live their lives. The rhythms of their work and days, the varieties of their religious experiences, the obstacles they face, and the efforts they shoulder to overcome them. In other words, what is absent is how they understand the meanings of their religion, the passions of their sorrow, and the struggle of their souls. But in today's landscape, none of that seems to matter. One could say that in the dawning years of the 21st century, when Arabs are the new chic and Islam is all the rage, Muslims and Arabs have become essentially a nagging problem to solve, one way or another. And being a problem is a strange experience, frustrating even.